We can go around the table and introduce ourselves. Linda Lakowski, School Committee.
We'll go next.
Dave Peterson, Selectman Raleigh.
Joe Berry, Selectman Raleigh.
Chuck DeKeegan, Selectman Salisbury.
Do I have to push it?
Yes.
Ronnie Ray Parrott, Selectman from Salisbury.
Mike Doyle, Selectman, Newbury.
Jeff Walker, Selectman, Newbury.
Mike, how are you?
Good, how you doing?
Erica Coles Jacobson, Chair, Finance Committee, Newbury.
Caitlin Hunter, School Committee.
Maureen Heffernan, School Committee.
He's doing amazing.
Kyle Warren, Business Admin, Triton.
Brian Forget, Superintendent.
Nursa Wallen, School Committee.
Can we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
I should say, if you can make your mics red when you're not talking, it'll.
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The next item is the meeting notes, in case anybody would like to read them. And now we're going to have a general update from Brian.
Okay, so before we talk budget, just to make sure you are, very loud, up to speed on changes and things that are taking place with regard to the school year. You know, I don't know that we've had a DCC since we chose to participate in the state testing program, so we're now sending home rapid antigen tests with all students and staff who opt in. Very simple. You say you want to participate in the test. We provide a testing kit every other week to all students and staff. Use one test that night on a Wednesday evening. Use the next test the following Wednesday evening. Report or any positive results are reported in through a Google form, ends up in the inbox of school nurses, and we've addressed the positives. I will say the number of responses and positives has been very low. The number of cases as we've been implementing these tests has been dropping pretty precipitously anyway, but it's only been a handful of staff and student cases that we've had reported on those take-home tests. So we have about 50%, approaching 50% of our student body participating, and a little north of 75% of our staff participating in that at-home testing program. So the most recent change, you've probably read, heard, or otherwise been informed that effective Monday, February 28th, when we return from school break, from February break, we will be mask optional. So this is, the governor released the statewide mask mandate effective February 28th. School committee met on Tuesday night and had a long discussion. This is one of those situations that I know you've dealt with in the town, at the town level. There's very strong opinions on both sides of this issue. Ultimately, when we worked, and I appreciate the cooperation with your board, the local boards of health, the public health directors and or the public health nurses in each of the towns, who ultimately agreed that they made the most sense, given the fact that this is the way the tide is moving, that there may be science that would suggest otherwise, but if we're not universally masking all the time in all places, then it makes sense to make this switch at this time. So Linda sent out a message later on Tuesday night, I think that was. I'll be sending another message tomorrow reiterating that this is, it's an opportunity to practice appreciation and respect for one another's opinions. Whether you choose to wear a mask or you choose to not wear a mask, whether you're a student or a staff member or a family member, we're asking that everyone respects one another's choices, and we're going to do everything we can to support those who choose not to wear masks, and we're going to do everything we can to support those who choose to choose to wear masks. So there's a couple details we're trying to figure out. One of the questions is, I don't know how much detail you've dug into this, but for days 6 through 10, after an individual is positive, per the CDC guidelines, it's supposed to have a rapid antigen test to be released on day 6, stay masked through day 10. If you don't test negative, you should remain in isolation. In schools, the test is not required. So the only way that can be required is in partnership with the local boards of health. So I have a correspondence that I'm preparing to send to each of the 3 towns' boards of health to have that discussion. Now that masking is optional, we still have to make sure anyone coming back from a positive test does mask for days 6 through 10. Obviously, that introduces some HIPAA concerns, but we're working through that. So just so that you're aware, there will be some communication with the town boards of health and hopefully getting on the same page with them. And I think it's important, whatever we do across all 3 towns so it takes place or it takes effect in all 5 schools. The masks will be required on school buses. That's a federal order. We don't have a choice there. And at the moment we are, bless you, we're keeping other mitigation efforts in place. So we're not just saying, okay, masks are off, the pandemic is over, and we're just going back to, no distancing. We're still distancing where possible, lunch to the greatest extent possible. Certainly at least through a return after February break to see what the cases do. Obviously, the hope is that we haven't seen a huge spike in cases after February, April break, like we do after the holidays. Obviously, the holidays, middle of winter, large groups gathering, February break, kids at least, tend to do what they always do after school and go to a friend's house. Or if people are traveling, they're on a beach somewhere warm, or they're up on a ski slope somewhere up north. Either way, they tend to be more outside for the break. So we haven't seen a spike in the past. We're hoping that is the case this year. So we'll certainly watch that closely. And obviously, if things go sideways, we're creating plans to be ready to respond to that. So those are the big updates. Eric, a question.
So is contact tracing now totally done?
Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, so that was part of, that didn't have anything to do with masks. That's part of adopting the state testing program. So when we implemented the tests, we then are no longer identifying close contacts within the school setting. The towns are still, it's district funded, but it's still under contract with the towns because your local boards of health have more authority than we do as a school. So there is a contract for, her name is Bonnie Barrington, that does all of the contact tracing for Triton cases. But within the school setting, so we still, any case that's identified, we contact the local board of health through Bonnie and do the appropriate tracing. But within the school setting, there isn't any tracing that's being done. So therefore, there's no test and stay, there's no isolation periods, there are quarantine periods. So that was a piece of the, to participate in the testing program, we had to drop contact tracing except for, I'm not gonna get the exact language, within the professional nursing decision, we need to make a change. So certainly if we saw multiple cases popping up in a classroom or with a specific sports team, we're gonna do some tracing and take some action, even though we technically had agreed we wouldn't be. So thank you for mentioning that. Any other questions about that? Okay, it's a quiet group tonight.
Actually, one more question.
Sure.
Are the outdoor tents going back up? Is that going to be used in the spring, or is it time to reclaim parking?
Do you sound like a parent of a high school student? So it's time to reclaim parking. So parking has been, it was necessary, it was good. So those tents are actually in the process of coming down. We were talking about, could we fit some of them in the courtyards? They'd have to trim some trees. It's great to have the covered space, but absolutely, that half of a parking lot that's missing has proven quite challenging. So those are in process of coming down. In the cafeterias now, with the way we're not going back to tables yet, but the way the cafeterias are set up, we're fitting all of the students in there and or the additional spaces. So yes, more parking spots are coming. You wouldn't imagine the fights about parking. You can report that to Cole, yeah.
The next item is the alternative assessment update.
You said alternative assessment. Alternative assessment. We're meeting again. We're meeting March, yes. Yeah. There's no update to give at this time.
You okay?
I did, yeah. Yeah, so landlord tenant, we've met. I need to catch you up, Joe, you weren't able to make the meeting, but met with Tracy Blaze for Newbury and Neil Harrington for Salisbury, and we have a draft lease that we're ready to talk about. Again, not ready to share with everyone yet in detail, but to review with council and make sure that we're agreeing that lease agreement would match what we've talked about to date. Just basically, in summary, I think I shared last time, basically codifying that if and when the determination that Salisbury Elementary is owned by the town of Salisbury, all three elementaries are treated the same. Anything under 20,000 is managed within the district budget. Anything over 20,000 is in partnership with the town, and it's just codifying that relationship. So again, the concept of a lease is that the regional agreement will say that we'll agree a leasing arrangement that can be reviewed between the school committee and the boards of selectmen. That's good, because then that means that we have the ability to make adjustments if the three boards and the school committee feel it makes sense. Otherwise, if we put that in the regional agreement, we have to go through the whole process, amend the regional agreement, bring it to town meeting. So we want the lease agreement where it's within the scope to make those changes in each of the boards. So that's the latest.
And the next item is the FY23 district budget development. Is that going to you or to Kyle?
So that's the real star of the show. So I'm just going to pass it right over to Kyle. And so we're going to make the assumption that there's been some information flowing your way, but certainly you have the document in front of you, and we'll have Kyle go through some cursory overview. Not going to give the full 2-hour presentation unless you so deeply desire that. You can let us know.
I'll try to keep it brief. So in front of you is the tentative operating budget that was voted on by the school committee at the February 9th meeting. Last night, actually, in terms of process, we had the budget hearing here last evening as well. Walking through the changes, I think at our last meeting, we had pretty much the same document, but there have been some tweaks since that point in time, so I do want to walk through it real quick. Starting on page 1 and this is a typical format from what we've had in the past few years, breaking out the changes by type. Starting at the top, we have our steps in cost of living adjustment increases relative to our 5 collective bargaining agreements. Those figures typically range right around $1 million. That's consistent. This year is consistent with prior years. What is unique this year is the $323,000 of collective personnel savings. That's where we've had significant turnover over the last 2 years. We've had folks retiring as well as transitions. The individual staff members that we've hired to replace those who have departed have been lower on the salary scale. Departed, I don't know if I want that word.
Did I sticker out loud? It sounds so morbid. Sorry. They've gone on to other jobs.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyway, so we have savings that we're realizing relative to those changes. There are also 2 elementary school full-time teaching positions that, due to attrition, were no longer needed and are unfilled. So total salary changes this year, we're looking at $664,000, comparable to around $1 million in prior years.
Can I just add one? So as we were going through the budget process last year, there were questions about our staffing and moving into the current year. And if you remember last year, we were saying it'll be nice next year when we're back to normal, but we didn't know what normal would be and what next year would look like. So we didn't make any adjustments to staffing. We knew that several students had left the district and gone on to private schools that were in person or homeschooling. We knew a bunch would return. We weren't sure. So this is the reality. That savings is the fact that we did what we said, and if we don't need the positions, we're not going to fill them. And so those savings we'll realize this year, and then they're removed from the budget next year. So just to make sure everyone's clear, that's the result of what we did, that we could have guessed, and if we had guessed and said we could remove them, great, we could have saved the money then. But instead, we're going to save it this year and then pull it out of the budget next year. But we didn't put positions in that we didn't need. We just had to wait to see who returned.
Thank you. Moving on to the middle part of the page, another favorable area this year is medical and dental insurance. Currently, our health insurance plans here at the district are out to bid. PEC is currently in negotiations with the final rates, but we're comfortable as part of this budget process, assuming a 0% renewal on all health insurance plans and a 7.3% decrease on dental premiums. So that's resulting in the $200,000 worth of savings. Unfortunately, that's going to be offset by retirement assessment over to Essex Regional. Similar with prior years, again, the funding schedule for the pension costs is through 2035, so we're seeing an increase in that assessment. Programming changes, special education, we have savings in the out-of-district tuition costs, is about $100,000, and the costs associated with that line item, we have a detailed roster of all the students and the out-of-district placements where they attend, and so there's, on an annual basis, shifts in that line item. Special ed contracted services, we're requesting a $100,000 increase. That's to address the increased new needs in our special education students. And then at the bottom of that first page there, general supplies and contracted services, an increase of $40,000. That's relative to inflation. We're seeing costs of all of our supplies increase. It's worth noting that we didn't just put a blanket 5 to 8% on a line item total. We went through each line item and then the detailed plan in those line items and selected which costs were actually increasing. So a lot of work associated with that one. Moving on to the second page, operational changes. Our utility rates are locked in through 2024, so we're not seeing a significant increase, thankfully, this year. And our usage, we expect to be pretty consistent. The new strategic spending, we're proposing $836,000 of total new spending initiatives. Starting at the top there, line item 21, $75,000 for the final year of the 3-year phase-in of free full-day K. So under this proposal, starting next year, full-day kindergarten would be free for all students. Next is a implementation of a Chromebook plan. So over the last year, since the start of the pandemic, we implemented a one-to-one Chromebook plan initiative that was entirely funded through COVID ESSER funds. So now looking long-term, we need to find a way to build this into the budget, pull it off those one-time funds, and then structurally into our operations. So through this plan that was developed by our IT director, we're proposing a $50,000 ask for that item. The next three, the district therapeutic program, the social worker, and the SEL educator, are all part of our initiative to better address the social and emotional needs of our student body, whether it's through the special education programming specifically or our general population of students. So we have 2 positions there for the one for the social worker and one for the SEL educator. The social worker specifically will work one-on-one with students. The SEL educator is to provide instruction in a more classroom setting. The next 2, NES and PGS reading interventionists, we're asking for a half-time position at each of those school locations. And then, let's see what else. The elementary STEM teacher, we're asking for a full-time position that would be shared by each of the 3 elementary schools. That was an ask by the principals at each of the elementaries. In the middle school office clerk, adding a half-time position there to help out with the morning phone calls and morning attendance. And lastly, the high school career counselor, we're asking for a full-time position there plus benefits to assist students with career readiness, not only with the college direction, but also those who choose to not go to college as well. So all in, we're looking at a proposed increase of just over 1.5 million, which is a 3.39% increase over last year. One item we did peel back from our initial conversations was a $25,000 request for a district marketing plan. After looking at our approach a little bit further, we have different sections of that marketing plan where there's a one-time cost associated with it, where we get up and running, and then there would be a maintenance, a multi-year maintenance associated with it. So where that $25,000 was associated with the prolonged maintenance of that program, we didn't feel we had a strong basis yet of determining exactly what that figure would be, so that's the reason we pulled it back. But our plan still is to use the one-time funds, whether it's grant funding or savings in our operating budget, to start that initiative. Before I go on to the funding plan, any questions on the changes? Okay. I'll go through this quick, I promise. Starting right at the top, we can see a total increase again of our general operating budget of $1.5 million. That's going to bring the total budget to just over $47 million. In terms of funding this budget, total outside of assessments, total new other revenues, we're anticipating an increase in our regional transportation aid received from the state of $55,000, and then an increase in Chapter 70 of $66,000 for a total of $121,000 of new revenue. So the balance of that increase would be supported by the community assessments. Right there in the middle of the page, you can see in yellow operating assessments for the 3 communities. So there's the 1.4 million increase, exactly 4%. And again, that disparity between the 1.4 and the 1.5 is the 121,000 of new revenues. One item worth mentioning too is on the capital debt budget. Something new this year is where the remaining debt that the district is paying off is associated with the stadium. And the stadium funding agreement stipulated that if the district's E&D, excess and deficiency, same thing as free cash, if that's exceeds $500,000 in a given year, then we're to utilize $90,000 of E&D to offset that assessment. That hasn't been included in here in this document yet because our E&D has not been certified. It should be very shortly, and certainly before this document is before the March 9th final budget. But that $264,000 total assessment to the communities, that will be reduced by $90,000. Any questions on that? Okay. I would say that's about it. The full document, again, consistent with, in format with prior years. There's a comparative data from FY19 to FY21, our FY22 and FY23 budget. There's a breakout of the budget by function and then by school location. We tried to add footnotes at the bottom of each school location to provide additional detail. And I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
I was going to say, one, there's been some questions about the class sizes page. So we pulled that out of the budget last year because we didn't make it, we just left it alone and forgot to put that back in here. But we will include that in with the final budget that shows the breakdown of Newbury Elementary School, the grade level, how many sections, the size of the sections, just so that you're aware of that.
Does anybody have any questions?
Questions? Comments?
I just have a question. I was here for the public hearing last night, and there was only one comment unrelated to the actual budget. Has the school committee received any other communications from community members about any, strong feelings on any of these proposed strategic positions, either yay or nay?
I have not received one single email on budget.
No, I would say people have focused their energy on other topics. The budget is, I believe Jim, when he was reporting on this last night, Jim Sullivan from the Daily News said something about it's been a quiet budget year. It's been very busy. Don't tell Kyle that it's been a quiet budget year. But yes, there have been other things competing for people's time. Have not heard a single statement.
Yes, I think that some of these are definitely addressing some of the, like the reading specialists, reading intervention specialists seem to be very necessary in this post-COVID to make sure that those kids that had learning loss are supported, that removing the masks alone is not going to change the education. So I'm hoping that there's some support for some of these things that are going to help us get out of the learning deficits or places where people think their children are falling behind, or that we can really support the kids who have not felt that they've been thriving under this last couple of years.
That's a good point. And the committee asked several questions. We had a lot of discussion about, we have ESSER funding, which is the federal funding, on the table still. And that obviously has to be earmarked towards pandemic mitigation, if you will. There are certainly new positions here that would qualify for that funding. But the question, and I don't remember who asked the question, but there was a lot of discussion about, is this long-term, is this short-term? And, the mental health, the discussion about mental health that we've been having, right? It's your life, Ronnie, right? I mean, I think it's the work that you do. I mean, there's so much. This is not new from the pandemic. The pandemic took us in a fast-forward way that no one was expecting, but the mental health and the social and emotional challenges that we've been seeing emerging over the last decade require a lot of attention. And so the full-time social worker being shared by the two elementary schools, Newbury and Pine Grove, because Salisbury has a full-time one. The Therapeutic program, that is a special ed program, so that will be a specific therapeutic program at the middle school, adding a psychologist with an existing educator, and adding a new educator at Pine Grove. That would be a district-wide therapeutic program. So those types of things. The SEL educator, I think even that is a proactive. It's the ability to deliver a curriculum to every elementary student, not just wait until we're in triage mode and needing to provide interventions through a clinical social worker or a therapist or anything else. So obviously, if you looked at the individual requests, everyone would love, the three elementaries would love their own STEM teacher and their own SEL teachers. Ultimately, we said, let's start with those two, a little proof of concept with those two positions, share them among the three schools. And if they prove to be as valuable as we think, maybe that's something that we have to talk about prioritizing in the future. But yeah, I think that's an important point that, yes, there is still federal funding on the table. And we've talked about ways, we've talked about everything from feasibility studies to other facility improvements to staffing. A lot of that has been spent on contracted services, so very specific services that are needed, especially through special education. So, yeah.
You could still, because, kids coming into my school right now can't read at all because they didn't learn on a remote class for 2 years. So that's huge right now. So this is wonderful that it's hiring because it is permanent, but I think the need may exceed even this. So even being able to use ESSER funds to do like a consultant that comes in for reading and what have you, so.
I think that's the key, right? And so everyone knows you work for the consortium. We've got these programs that we've worked with through the consortium. We're a member of CREST, directly through Home for Little Wanderers. So all these services that are true interventions, and in many cases, it's when we have someone in crisis that we're able to use that ESSER funding because that's short term, right? We know we're not going to have that, so it's not hiring someone. It's great, we can hire people short term, but then when they go, if the funding goes away, we're stuck with the FICA, we're stuck with the unemployment, we're stuck with all those costs long term. So it's absolutely, those are the things that we've spent hundreds of thousands on, those services that are more intervention based rather than the long-term positions.
Where is the therapeutic program? Is that the middle school or?
So it's two positions. It's using an existing educator at the middle school to identify the program and adding a psychologist. And then thinking at Pine Grove School, a district-wide program, adding a new educator. The other psychological services are available, BCBA and all that. So I think we said, last discussion with Shannon, there were 4 or 5 students that right now we believe would qualify, right? And interested in staying, which, you know the math, right? If you talk about 4 or 5 students out with transportation, they could each be $80,000 to $100,000. So it's absolutely more cost effective. So that is proposed as new spending, but we've used the term in the past, cost avoidance. We're going to spend that money. The question is, do we educate the students in their home school, or are they outplaced to another school?
So it's 2, it's both elementary school and middle school. Pine Grove will be identified.
For the
5 kids.
And so it's building it as a K through 8 program, obviously middle school kids at the middle school, but, and actually Shannon's done a lot of work doing more specific descriptions for the in-district programs. We talk about the ASD program at Newbury, and not just the label of autism spectrum disorder, but what are the identifying behaviors and what are the required services. And even someone who may not have a diagnosis of autism, but if needs that, then the program is there. Likewise, there may be someone who does have an autism diagnosis and they don't need that program. So similarly, it's kind of creating that track like we have for the autism spectrum disorder for that, the therapeutic program. Have my people call you people. Yeah. I was gonna say, our people talk all the time. Yeah, yeah.
Is there any other questions? Go ahead. Chuck.
Sure.
Can you put your mic on, please?
I'm going to put my mask down too for a second. Well, let me go back. Revenues. You have revenue from circuit breaker, and you have revenues that you collect from various,
Tuitions and things.
yeah. Where is that?
So tuitions, let me speak to that, Kyle. So, you want to go?
Yep, so tuitions for like pre-K and formerly full-day kindergarten, those are accounted for in a revolving fund. So because it's supposed to be a self-supporting operation, it's accounted for in a separate fund outside of the general operating budget. In the back of this document, starting on page 36, is a listing of all of the revolving funds that we utilize at the district with a description of each, along with a budget for next year.
I see. So those, all right, so, for example, let's take the first one.
Food services, yeah.
Food services. Okay, there, you have the receipts, and then you have the expenses. So those expenses are not in this budget, is that correct?
That's correct. They're
Okay.
legally required to be accounted for in a separate revolving fund.
Thank you.
Yep.
And the circuit breaker money, how does that work?
Similar, so it's in a separate fund outside of the general operating budget, and so we'll receive in from the state a reimbursement for the out-of-district, a portion of the out-of-district tuition costs that the district pays, as well as something new, a portion of the out-of-district transportation special ed costs as well. There's a chart on page that details how we arrive at those numbers. It's on page 35.
35, yeah?
Yep. This is, I'm glad you brought this up because it is a slight change from prior years, where each year as part of the budget process, we would need to know what that state reimbursement was so that we could shift costs over to that fund appropriately. Now, the goal is to work towards having sufficient reserves in that fund so that we can better know what number to use for budgeting. Trying to think of a good way to explain it. Instead of having to wait for the state figure, now we have a known number to where we use a portion of our fund balance. So we were able to be less conservative this year, and that's why you saw in the front, in one of the changes, a decrease in special ed out-of-district tuition costs, is because we were able to be less conservative. But that's probably more info. Yeah, that's where that's accounted for.
I was gonna say, on page 35, where it says 1.16 million, it says circuit breaker carry forward, that's always been circuit breaker receipts, and we've had to wait until June 30th to know what that number is. And that's not even true, because we had to wait until everyone filed their end-of-year reports next year to know what reimbursement we're gonna get. So now that we were able to get that carry forward, we know that 1.16 is what was available at the end of the year, so that's a firm number. And then over the course of this year, it will replenish it again, and then we'll budget that next year. So that was the design. DESI has said that for 20 years since circuit breaker was put in place. We've never been in a place to be able to do what we did last year and delay the year. That makes sense?
So, all right, so that's your base figure then, this year, 1.1?
So that's what we ended last year with,
Yeah,
and we're budgeting for next year,
yeah,
because it's a solid number. We don't have to guess.
right.
That's available.
Okay, now where are the expenses for that? Where are,
So in that chart, if I may, so right at the top of that chart, it's identifying that as a whole, the district is expecting to incur 3.2 million of total costs. And then,
got it.
just real quick, 1.1 is going to be supported by the state reimbursement. 1.3, that last item, that's supported by the budget. Yep.
So just to tie it all together, page 35 and page 22, the bottom of page 35 says the net cost is 1.268. If you look at the 9,000 special ed tuitions on page 22, you see that same 1.268. So to make it confusing, that makes sense, right? Okay, no. So to add to confusion, so for circuit breaker, I know, stop. No, I want to do it because this is the stupidest thing the state does. That is so not true. There are so many things that are stupider than this, more stupid. Circuit breaker makes sense. It's a special ed cost. The state is reimbursing some of the costs, so we net it and budget the difference, right? School choice we receive in a revolving, but we can't net off the cost. We then have to assess what we're going to pay in school choice. Also there on the bottom of page 22. So you can see school choice tuitions, we've got 560,000 that we're expecting. That's in the general fund budget. That is part of the cost we assess to you. In the back, you'll see a revolving account for school choice receiving. We then offset the salaries out of that aren't in the budget, so it's the same thing, but it would be so much smarter and easier if we could create a page for circuit breaker, for school choice, like we do for circuit breaker, and say to you, here's what we're getting in, here's what we're getting out, here's the net difference, or here's the cost, or the net savings, or the revenue, or whatever it is. So, did that make things really bad? Sorry.
Can I add another point to that too? So for people that having a therapeutic program will ultimately decrease that $3.2 million, which is why in-district programs are even though they're money up front, they're so important to have, because in the long run, you decrease that budget.
Yes.
Because I know how much you pay to go to my school, so.
Exactly. Not to put Ronnie out of a job, but we want kids in their home school getting the services they need. I was just going to say, Ronnie's good. Yeah, and that 3.2, that's a lot of money, right? And I think that's another part of the discussion is we talked last month about restructuring central office and the positions. So we currently had an assistant superintendent and a coordinator. What was that? Is it teaching and learning coordinator? We're kind of combining, getting rid of one of those. I'm going to have a director of teaching, learning, and assessment. That additional administrative position we're splitting up in a cost-neutral way to create a special education coordinator to spend more time focusing and building those relationships with the out-of-district placements and even develop those in-district programs, because the assumption cannot be and should not be that when we lose a student, when we can't meet the needs, they go out in third grade, that they're out for the balance of their education. We should be working towards when's the right time to transition back. But it takes a lot of time and attention in building relationships, so that will be one of the focus areas.
Just a quick one. What's the status of school choice in and out? How do we stand on numbers for this year, for instance?
Yep. So for this year, we're about, 10 students to the negative. So we were twice as many out in 2008 as in, and then we swung the other way by 2014 and had twice as many in as we have out. That's great. We receive money, but we don't want to balance. By 18, we were balanced. The last few years created the ripples. We're currently about 10 more students out than in. Next year, we have 20 of the 106. Oh, these aren't. We have about 20 of them are seniors. So about 20% of the students on our Choice Out roster are going to fall off next year and will be back slightly to the good next year. Yep. Again, there were times when we used school choice as a kind of a revenue source, and it gets us into trouble. We want to just break even. That's the goal. However many we're losing, we want to bring in.
Are we accepting students in all grades, or is there any that are?
Yep. So the committee, there are districts that take a vote so by February, by the end of February, I forget the deadline, we have to notify the department if we're open for school choice. It then gets published on the website. These districts are available. The committee then allows me to make a decision by the last day of school where we have openings. And so we wait until June to register all of our residents. If you live in Newbury-Byfield, you're going to have a first dib at Newbury Elementary. We then look at intra-district, so if someone in Newbury wanted to go to Salisbury, next priority, and then we take those who live outside the district. So we make those determinations by the last day of school. So, yeah. So we have not, the numbers that we've been taking have been precipitously less. We tend to take the most in kindergarten, right? And it's when you have an application for a junior in high school, you wonder what the story is, or kind of those midpoints. Kindergarten makes sense. Starting early and staying here the whole time. So the majority of the new choice students have been kindergarten. But we do accept various throughout. And again, if we have more seats than applications, we take everyone. If we have more applications than seats, we either take no one or we do a blind lottery based on the number of seats.
Do we see a drop-off from the kindergarten when they're leaving the elementary to go into middle? Do they then go back to their original district?
That's a good question. I haven't looked at that in a long time. That's a great question. We can dig that data up. Folks tend to, when they move in, tend to stay. But that's a great question in this kind of ongoing discussion.
Yeah, anecdotally.
It is the time we lose, when students move off to the middle school. So.
Right.
Is that a lot of, because I know in my son's that there were numerous teachers' kids. So are a lot of those kindergarten, like you work in the 3 districts?
Gotcha.
And,
Yep.
so you don't want your kid to go to this school or that school, so you school choice your child into Newbury, Raleigh, Salisbury, wherever it may be. So I know that, again, in my son's class, there were 4 kids that didn't live in the district, but they were children of.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we can take a look at that. Trying to pull that data.
Any other questions?
I'm sorry, one last question, and just because it caught my eyes, we were looking at some of the other things. I don't see anything in line item for stabilization. Was that something that I thought was talked about as being strategic? Is that not a goal this year?
Right, so, great question. So, as part of the funding plan, we are proposing that a stabilization fund be adopted, so that'll require a vote first of the school committee and then the 3 communities at the annual town meeting. And then because this budget is being voted before that stabilization fund could theoretically exist, we can't include it next year.
Thank you for the clarification.
Correct, yep. To establish. So it'd be a majority vote of the school committee, and then we'll pass along the language to the communities, and it would be a majority vote of the communities as well. Thank you.
All right, one last question. I think I brought it up once before, is OPEB. What's the long-term look at how the school's going to handle OPEB?
So as part of, the district's been looking at OPEB, stabilization, reserves, all as a whole. Part of our plan right now that we're proposing is to layer in a funding plan each year, kind of like how we did for free full-day K. So our approach is to start next budget season in a $75,000 per year layer. So essentially, to get to the end of it, we're proposing that a line item for stabilization be included for $150,000, and then further down the line, $150,000 for OPEB as well, and just slowly making our way there. And it doesn't get us to where we need to be, but it's a step in the right direction, certainly.
And so in essence, that keeps, right? So we've been adding 75,000 a year for full day K. Next year is the third day. We then have full day K. Hoorah, after talking about that for a decade. And then it's just continuing that $75,000 increase for 4 more years. So that 300,000. And then to note, Kyle always talks about once our Essex Regional, same thing for all the 3 towns, in 2035. I think it's the year after I retire. Well, the microphone was on. That-ish, 800,000-ish would be redirected, as far as the policy that the committee has drafted, would be redirected from Essex Regional into OPEB. So we would go from adding 150,000 a year in 12 more years to a significant jump. But I think it's important to note, so, and I never understood this, and you were explaining that it's not right, whatever the liability is now, 112,000. It's not that stays forever, and we just have to keep chipping away. As we start to make contributions and our position improves, the overall liability starts to come down until they meet. So it's not a perpetual need to chase that high water mark. They tend to, because of discount rates and all that, tend to kind of come towards each other. So we need to be making some progress towards, which is nice to have a plan in process.
Yes, Bernie?
Should I say my name? Should I be able to? So just one point of clarification in that last answer, you said thousands, 112,000. I think you meant 112 million.
If I was talking about liability, I was absolutely talking in millions, yes.
Okay. All right. So a couple of things. First note clearly is this is an above the kind of target increases for that the towns envisage, because it comes in around 4%, and we're thinking more like 2.5%, 3%. So we're still kind of changing the share of the town's budgets that are going to the school. That's the math. But it's kind of an acceptable level. It looks acceptable. It's certainly based upon the reactions everybody has had. Nobody is, unlike a few years ago, nobody is kind of pushing back really hard. I'm not pushing back really hard, so I guess that's one thing. But by my calculation, around $500,000 of this savings are one-time savings. So next year, that 500,000, is that going to be still there, or is that going to, because we're not going to get another personnel savings of 300,000. That's a one-time drop in the personnel savings. It's not going to show up as a savings. So all those net, like the total salary changes we've got this year is 664,000. But part of that is the savings of 300,000. Typically, we come in at around $1 million.
Yep. And that would be the assumption.
Next year, it'll be $1 million.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, the next year's budget is not going to be as benign for the towns as this year's budget. That's true not only on the salary line, it's also true on the medical and dental insurance. You're not going to get another drop.
No,
like
and
we
that's
have.
a fair statement, and again, we talked, it's not on a page in the budget. The anomaly this year were Salisbury, because of the drop in enrollments, remember we had that Salisbury's assessment, mine keeps blinking. Salisbury's assessment is falsely deflated this year.
Right.
And Rowley's would have been more inflated, but Newbury's also increased in a kind of a different way than we expected. So all of that on a normal year would reset back, right? And roughly 39% of the increase would go to Salisbury. So this is not a harbinger of things to come.
This is an easier year, budget-wise, than next year is going to be, all other things being constant. Not that they ever are, but
I agree. One thing I just really want to reinforce is that we're not using one-time funds to balance the budget, like E&D or the health insurance premium holiday we received this year. That's truly a one-time funding source that would have to be recuperated the next year. That's not what this discussion is. But to your point, it's a more favorable year because we have those structural savings that we'll realize this year.
And not just spending up all those savings this year either, allowing them to flow through to reserves, as we keep talking about.
Right, so it's in a certain sense, it's a breathing year for the towns and a breathing year for the school. But down the road, we're still on this track for increasing beyond basically what the towns are ready to pay. So it's kind of an opportunity to kind of look hard at all the spending areas, because in a certain sense, we want to try and find, or at least I would be trying to find $500,000 to take out of next year's budget in order to kind of keep it moving in the same kind of general direction. Like that's going to be really, really tough. But that's in fact the challenge if we're not going to be, this time next year, going to be looking at increases to the towns, which is simply not, the towns can't afford. Because that's what's built in to the way the budget is designed at this point. So that was one point. The second point is all this is within the broader context of, for the towns, of we're going to be refurbishing this campus. And that's going to be a very significant amount of money with or without state help. The refurbishment is going to be there, and we're still looking at tens of millions of dollars with, roughly speaking, $10 to $20 million burden going to each of the three towns. So, I mean, those are just rough estimates based upon the architect's assessment of what needs to be done.
Well, and I would just say that was a repair bill. That wouldn't be what we'd be doing, right? We talked about there's a lot of things that we wouldn't repair, right? So it's way too early to talk about any figures at all. But yes, there is absolutely a large price tag to address the needs at this campus. We're most likely 3-4 years away from knowing what those exact numbers are.
Right, but the two issues, the operating budget and then what will not ultimately be a capital budget, have to be considered kind of together, at least from the town's perspective, because those are the same. With the dollars, the tax dollars don't make that difference. They don't kind of recognize that differentiation. So I guess I'm just saying that we need to be thinking about that bigger picture at the same time as we're approaching the next few years' operating budgets as well, because that is going to happen, and we're coming close to the limit that the towns can actually digest. So I don't expect answers to that. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Bernie.
Quick question. Can you explain the medical holiday again? Why we got there and how and it's only one-shot deal this year only?
Correct, yeah. So that's the medical premium holiday was given to the district and then shared by the district and the employees, where it's a one-time savings. So they said this year, instead of paying 12 months worth of premiums, you only have to pay 11. But that's one time, and it's not promised for the future. So it's not a structural decrease like Bernie was chatting about, where if we know we won't have a position anymore, we can reduce that position.
What company, just out of curiosity?
Say again?
What company? What health insurance company?
Newbury and Rowley got it too. It's Maya.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's Maya Health Insurance. So the difference is if the savings that the Maya Trust had, right, they could have lowered everyone's rates, but then next year when they go to increase, they're starting at a lower number. So they adjusted everyone's rates accordingly, where they should be, what the underwriter said, and then said, okay, we can give everyone a 1-month premium holiday with the savings that we needed without affecting. So if our rates went up 10, they didn't, what, a percent this year, they still went up, but then we got a premium holiday, because that's just one time. And then next year, when they increase or decrease, it's off of that higher amount, rather than decreasing the overall rates.
Okay, so the question, if you get a family plan for one teacher, what is the price, total price? Because I was at a meeting last week with the veterans, and it blew my socks off what the price is up to.
Yeah, so when we budget our cost, if someone takes
For-
all of the family plans,
Per family plan, what are you spending per family plan? Not what, the total amount, not what they pay, but what we all pay, the district and the recipient.
yeah, if you go to page, what is it, 33?
I'm trying to find it, it's like,
So this is extrapolating.
Yeah, so on page 34,
okay,
the monthly rate, so if you look at HMO Blue Family up at the top,
yeah,
that rate, 2,257 times 12 is the total cost. So was that 26,000-ish?
yeah, because that's, because the figure I got thrown at me was 30.
Yeah.
And I
So
just-
we don't have the best rates in the biz, but we've got decent rates.
You're not
and
the
really-
worst either.
No, no. And we've got very good plan for the rates that
Yeah,
match
it's
them.
like, it's just, healthcare insurance is just, it's gone out of, it's out of
Crazy,
control.
yeah.
And then when you add co-payments, I'm not sure if you played with that at all when you were
Oh, yeah.
negotiations.
Yeah, we've redesigned every 3 years, so we're currently, literally, spent 3 hours today with the PEC negotiating healthcare.
Yeah.
So every year, we've redesigned the plans. This year, we've had a couple great years, so we're looking at other competitors and not plan design. But the thing we added last time, go around 3 years ago, was a high deductible plan. So we now have a high deductible plan where we contribute some of the savings to an HSA, and it's a $2,000, $4,000 deductible. So we've changed the plans, changed copays, raised copays to play with the rates over the years. But
Okay.
yeah, it's
Thank you.
not a cheap endeavor.
Well, it's getting out of hand.
Yeah. And we've heard this from consultants, from presentations today. I don't know what the kind of the COVID rebound, the concern is everyone kind of delayed necessary health care for the 2 years. There was actually a rebound kind of over the summer into the fall, and then Omicron hit and it slowed down again for the last couple months, and it's emerging again. But our folks didn't, right? Our plans, we have incredible rates, and people are still accessing, and our everything for the past 2 years is looking very atypical, which, again, to Bernie's point, minus 200,000 on medical, I can tell you in my 17 years in this district, we've never done that before. And that's without changing anything. That's just the nature of the beast. So it's, yes, we'll take it this year, but we can't expect it's going to be the norm. Yeah.
Any other questions, concerns? Okay, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. We have a meeting next Wednesday, March 2nd at, not next Wednesday. Ooh. Yes, 2 Wednesdays from now. Next week is vacations. So March 2nd and March 9th, we have a meeting at 7 o'clock. And one of those two dates, we're trying to get the senators back. And our legislators. So I want to thank you all for being here. Have a good night. It's in